Hi class, it's Dr. DiBiase, and today we're going to be recapping our week on discourse and community and thinking about the way that writing and reading and literacy more broadly operate in our world. So that's sort of the big question that our authors were contending with this week, right? How does language work in the world? And they all address this question in different ways. If we look at G, right, G wants us to recognize that we can't understand reading and writing if we don't understand the broader context that reading and writing exists in, right? So we have to understand literacy as sort of a social phenomena. Turning to Mirabelli, right, we get the sense that even, quote unquote, everyday jobs, right? He looks at, people within the service industry, waiters and waitresses, in particular, require their participants to be fluent in complex literacies that go beyond just a simple reading and writing. And we see the various kinds of rhetorical strategies that waiters make use of, for example, when reviewing a menu, which is sort of a key organizing genre of a restaurant or a diner. We get the sense that language and literacy practices are tied to a sense of identity. So G talks about this relatively explicitly in terms of thinking about discourse as an identity kit. But class also references this as well, talking about how people's language practices can be tied to their sense of who they are. In this case, right, some medical professionals are so enamored with the sense of themselves as medical professionals that they really lean hard into medical terminology as a way of to demonstrate that. We also get the sense that language provides a way to structure communities, and Swales is sort of our touchstone here, right? Establishing the concept of a discourse community, a community organized by discernible goals and language use and participation, and then we see an application of that in the Feldman essay about Star Wars fan communities. And I say that as I'm wearing my yet another one of my Father's Day Star Wars shirts from my daughter. So I can definitely appreciate the idea of that particular discourse community. More broadly, right, we get the sense that the way language is used tells us something about the community that uses it. And we see that really across all of the various authors that we read this week. So before we go any further, I want to talk a little bit about the concept of a theory. Because for your major project 2, you need to determine which of these two central theories that we looked at this week, whether that's G's theory of discourse or Swale's theory of discourse communities, or his formulation of that theory of discourse communities, which of those will be sort of the framework for your project. So what's a theory and what distinguishes a theory from a fact? So a fact, and I'm taking this definition, I'll concede I'm sort of stealing this a little bit from a former professor of mine when I was a student at Fairfield, Dr. John McCarthy, who's no longer there. But one way he would help us understand what a fact would be to think about it in terms of some sort of observable phenomena, right? Something that we can observe. And that if you have a bunch of outside observers, they're all going to agree upon what they observed. So, the example he would generally use would be holding up a pen and say, do we all agree that this is a pen? Yes? Okay, so we can acknowledge that it's a fact that I'm holding up a pen, right? Because every outside observer is agreeing upon what we're looking at. A theory isn't in the same kind of category as a fact, right? A theory is not a statement of fact, it's a statement of why something occurs or how something occurs that accompanies the what of the phenomena. So if you are, say, okay, I'm holding a pen and I let it go and it falls to the ground, you would need a theory to explain why it behaved the way that it behaved. So we might all agree upon what we saw, but we might have disagreements about why what we saw occurred in the way that it happened. So, we're talking about G and Swales' theories, right? So, again, these are very reductive summaries of their theories, but for G, it's essentially you can't understand what it means to be literate if you don't understand the social context in which that definition exists. So the notion here is that what it means to be literate or to be perceived as being literate is going to vary from context to context, and in order to understand how that definition is operating, you need to understand more than just, or you have to look at more than just what's being said and what's being written. You have to look at a whole host of other issues, right? Values, beliefs, expectations of behavior, etc., that help provide necessary context for understanding how it is that we determine within a group whether or not someone constitutes a degree of literacy that would make them an insider. With Swales, his theory is really about how do we understand the way that communities operate through the lens of the language that they use, right? In particular, so Swales, he gets to start really looking at sort of academic communities, right? So how can we distinguish between academic communities by looking really carefully at the genres that they make use of? But you can apply it, as we saw in the Feldman piece, more broadly. And so you can't, for Swales, understand how community operates if you don't attend to how language and its use shape and organize those communities. And he calls our attention to things like jargon, codes, genres, rhetorical expectations. And we see some of that, the class essay, really, I think, illustrates that particularly well. So when we're thinking about theories, right, it's important to not think about theories as being, oh, this theory is true or this theory is false. That's not a particularly helpful way of assessing which theory you want to use for a project, right? And in fact, it's even probably a good idea to stop thinking about them or think about them less in terms of, is this theory right or wrong? Instead, we really need to think about whether or not a theory is useful or not useful. And what determines its use is something we'll call explanatory power, right? So how well does it explain the phenomena that we observe, or the thing that we're looking at? How well does it, how well does it help us understand the things that we are investigating? And so, when you're trying to weigh out whether you want to look at G or Swales for your projects, one of the things you'll need to consider, one of the things you'll have to consider is, how well do you understand the arguments that are being made? But you're also going to have to think about what are the things that I'm most interested in looking at. So, for example, if you are really interested in looking at, for example, what Swales would call the lexis of a community, right, the specialized terminology and codes, or if, for example, you were really interested in his idea of silential relations, right, those things that go without saying within a particular kind of community, then that theory might be more useful to you. On the other hand, if you're sort of more interested in thinking about how issues of being and doing or valuing, the values that an individual holds shapes the way that they're perceived, then G might be a more useful theoretical framework to make use of. So at the core of this, right, and what's sort of at the core of this project that you're working on right now is, what does it mean to be literate, and what does it mean to have authority? So for G, right, and actually let's come back to this for 1 second, and I'll come back to this again at the end of the lecture, but for both G and for Swales, there is a sense that, and I want you to keep this in mind, literacy is not something that you simply possess, right? It's not something that you just have. It is something that you are recognized as having, right? That you are only literate insofar as other people recognize you as being literate. And you only have authority insofar as other individuals within the community recognize that authority. So what does that mean for G? Well, we'll go back to his the combination of factors that he associates with his concept of discourse, right? So he says saying, writing, doing, being, believing, and valuing. And what I'm going to do is run through each of these and try to provide some examples. I'm going to kind of pull a Swales here and talk a little bit about the communities that I participate in, and try and give you a sense of what it might mean to apply some of these ideas to your own communities that you're looking at, and hopefully that will be helpful for your projects. So when we talk about saying and writing, right, we can talk about it in a number of ways. So we can talk about in terms of lexis, which is a term I'm borrowing for Swales that refers to sort of the specific language that's used. So if you took literature classes, you might have talked about diction, right? This is the jargon, the specialized terminology, right? We could talk about tone that a writer or a speaker might use. We could talk about register, and I just want to point out really funny, this is an auto-generated icon that is showing a cash register. That is not the kind of register we're talking about here, but I thought it was funny, so I'm going to leave it. Register sort of refers to, within a particular kind of speech pattern, the degree of formality that one uses. So, for example, I might say, if I'm giving a lecture, I might say, I am going to post a video to our class. If I am at home and I'm talking in a less formal register, I might say, I'm gonna post a video to class. And if I'm going like super informal, I might just say, I'm gonna post a video later, right? And those are just different kinds of registers. It's conveying the same thing, but with different degrees of formality based on the context. We can also talk about genres, rhetoric, content, right? So genres, like what forms of communication do we use? Rhetoric, what kinds of arguments are considered valid or useful in a particular context? Content, what are the things that we talk about or speak about, or don't talk about or speak about? So if I was talking about writing studies as a discourse, right? The lexis might involve specialized terms like the ones you see on this slide. Or it might involve, terms like process or post-process, terms like genre, right? Are all terms that we might use. There are a whole host of terms tied to the study of rhetoric that we might discuss as well, that I would use in my professional capacities, but I wouldn't really make use of them outside of the classroom or outside of a publication or a conference presentation. In terms of tone, right, as a in the discourse of writing studies, right, if I'm engaging in a professional disagreement, right, there are expectations about what my tone should be, the formality of my language, my register, right. In terms of genres, I need to, in order to be sort of recognized as fluent in this discourse, I need to show that I know what a conference presentation should look like. I need to be able to, show what a scholarly article looks like, right? I need to be able to write in these particular forms. And this actually, if you go back to the idea of, genre sets earlier on, right? I often have to write proposals, right, for conferences or for funding, right? So these are genres that, as a member of this discourse or a participant in this discourse, I need to demonstrate that I'm able to do. In terms of doing, right? This can involve everything from behavior to body language to self-presentation to activities, professions, interactions. So basically, how does one carry oneself and how does one engage in certain things? So again, you think about what are the kinds of activities that mark someone as being a professor, right? The discourse of academia, right? What marks you as a professor? Reading, writing, researching, teaching, right? These are all kinds of things that one does that sort of signal that this is who you are. The way you conduct your classroom, is part of that doing. If we think about this in the context of, job interviews or things like that, right? Just to give a very sort of clear thing, you're judged on your body language, right? Do you carry yourself with authority when you walk into the interview? If I think about other forms of doing and how that demonstrates sort of authority or mastery of the language or the literacy that's tied to a discourse, right? One of the discourses that I participate in is I play a lot of games. And so this is all obviously pre-pandemic, but I would, head over to the local game shop or local comic shop to, play board games or card games, etc. And there are certain ways of acting that are considered appropriate in those contexts, right? So whether it's how to properly shuffle a deck or how to interact with an opponent, these are all sort of, unspoken codes of conduct, related to the concept of doing, right? That shapes the way in which one is perceived. We could also think this, more broadly in terms of some larger larger discourses, right? And I think I've spoken to a couple of you about this. When we think about discourses around gender, right? What does it mean to be read as, fluent in the discourse of, masculinity or femininity or maleness or femaleness? there are frequently expectations about how one acts, right? So if you've ever heard like, oh, that's not ladylike, right? That is an effort to enforce a particular kind of behavior tied to the larger discourse around that gender within a particular kind of culture. Or I think this is much of a less of an issue now than it used to be, but like when I was a kid and you went to a toy store, it was very, 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 very clearly broken down between, quote unquote, boys' toys and girls' toys, right? That there were certain kinds of doing that were expected as part of the broader discourse of a particular kind of gender. When we talk about being, and this one's kind of tricky to discuss, but I'm going to do my best here. We can really think about this in terms of identity categories, right? So G says in his piece, it's not just what you say or how you say it. Part of it is who you are while you're saying it. So I'll give you a couple of examples of this, right? So this could refer to things like gender, race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, ableness, age. If you think about, for example, the history of higher education, right? Prior to 1960s ish, prior to what was called the open admissions movement, even public institutions could opt not to accept students on really any criteria they wanted, whether that was race, whether that was gender. And so as a result, you could very much find yourself in a situation where who you were impacted the way that you were read in terms of this kind of literacy sponsorship. And we see this in other ways as well. There's no shortage of studies that have looked at resumes, right, where it's been demonstrated that given the identical resume, right, it's a prefabricated resume. If the name that's attached to the resume is a name that is sort of read as female or read as belonging to a non-white racial or ethnic group, that the individual is less likely to be called in for an interview, even if the content of the resume is the same. And so, one of the points that G makes is that the degree to which you are received as an authority can be shaped by that very core sense of who you are, right, and the way that you are read by other individuals. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as well. When we think about valuing, we think about what matters, what's important to a particular kind of community, and do you display that? So for if you're a professor, right, you need to demonstrate that you think that teaching is important, research is important, serving your institution is important. If you're a professor who sort of scoffs at the idea of teaching, at least at a school like Fairfield, you would be looked at with a lot of suspicion. In the same way that at a major research institution, if you sort of suggested that you felt that research was not that important, you would also be looked at with significant degrees of suspicion. And so, for G, it's not just, again, what you say. And he goes back to the example of the woman on the mock interview. You can put together grammatically correct sentences, but if they don't convey the values of the community with whom you're talking, you will be seen as an outsider. And then again, in terms of believing, right, what beliefs are treated as a general assumption of those in the discourse. So, I think one of the key beliefs, for example, of, the discourse of teaching, right, is the belief that students can improve, right? That particularly with writing studies, right, the idea that all students can become more effective writers is like a core belief. And if you were to teach in such a way that did not convey that belief, right, that would also sort of mark you as an outsider within the community. Now, for Swales, right, he is more interested in thinking about these different kinds of communities that are bound up in discussions of discourse, right, that are organized through language and discourse. So Swales identifies, 3 different kinds of discourse communities: local communities, focal communities, and faux local communities. And he breaks down a couple of subsets. So in local, there could be residential communities, vocational communities, professional communities. We won't get too much into those distinctions here, but it's important to note that for Swales, right, discourse communities are communities of individuals that are structured around, or are at least structured in part by their use of language. And one big difference between Swales and G here is that, G's discourses are much more abstract, whereas the communities that Swales is looking at are much easier to kind of see in a concrete fashion. Regardless of the kind of discourse community, there are 8 kind of features that Swales identifies with a discourse community, right? So it has goals, right? There are discernible goals, and although every member of that community might not share the exact same goals or share a sense of how to best achieve those goals, you can see goals when you look at the community carefully. There's intercommunication, right? So there has to be some way that members of that community interact with one another. And a good way, a good example to put this is if you had like a television show, right? And a bunch of people watched that show, but they never talked to each other about that show. Even if they're all fans of the same program, if they're not communicating with one another about that program, they are not a discourse community. Right? So it's more than just a shared interest. There has to be some level of interaction. Participation, right? So not only do they communicate with one another, but there are ways for these members to participate in discussions of concern within the community, whether that's about how to expand the community, whether that's about how to manage operations within the community. There are certain genres that are important. So there are certain ways of communicating that you would need to know how to do. And again, this comes up a little bit in terms of the writing saying category in G. These communities frequently have a lexis, right? So they have specialized terminology. If you've ever worked at some sort of summer job, most jobs you sort of pick up the language of the job, specialized terminology to what you're doing. So what will be some examples of this? There might be certain codes for, so I used to work at Sports Authority when I was in college, and we had a special code that, I don't remember what the terminology was. It was so long ago, but if you heard it over the intercom system, it meant that there was a security issue and that you had to go to a designated location, right? Or there's a special code for, if a parent had reported a missing child in the store, right? So not to call attention to the fact that there was a missing child, but there'd be like some sort of Amber, pick up line 1 or something to that effect, right? And you would know that that was the language for that. There's a degree of expertise or hierarchy. So there's a means by which we can determine who has more expertise than others. And this is sort of interesting in that it distinguishes itself from G a little bit, because for G you either have it or you don't, whereas in Swales there is this sort of hierarchy of sort of lower level experience and higher level experience. In academia, right, in sort of the discourse community of academics, this is, you can see this by level of degree, right? So undergraduate, master's, doctoral degree, but also by faculty rank, right? Associate, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, all connote, a certain degree of expertise or hierarchy. Departments frequently have chairs or vice chairs that help organize the events of the department. There are deans and provosts, right? And even in less formal communities, there tends to be ways to distinguish, who has the most authority within that community. Whether that is, demonstrating knowledge in a particular way, or demonstrating expertise in a particular skill in a particular way. But there is some sort of organizational hierarchy. Swales also brings us to the idea of silential relations, right? The idea that in any of these communities, right, there are things that go without saying that members just instinctively sort of know or understand. And so that tells us something about the fact that in this particular community, communication is happens in such a way that people begin to develop a sense of shorthand, right? So that they don't have to always, spell out exactly what they're doing or why they're doing it. And then all of these communities, right, there's an sense of expectations, right? There is some way of determining what counts as G puts it, good, or I'm sorry, as Swales puts it, good versus less good work within that community, right? So in academia, that might mean what is a good article or a good lesson plan or a good course design. In business, what is a good form of analysis or good marketing strategy. In a medical setting, right, what constitutes good patient care, right? That within this community, they're able to develop sort of standards of what counts as good or useful, and are able to sort of assess performance based on that. So what are some of the big common features that we should be thinking about? Well, again, participation in language shapes your role in the group, right? So the way that you make use of language, the way in which you demonstrate literacy skills, shapes how you are perceived by the group, and that then shapes the degree to which you have access to the benefits of that group. Markers of insider or outsider status can be tied to language. And this is particularly big with G, but both of them sort of address the fact that in order to be sort of seen as an insider, you need to master sort of not just the language, but the ways in which that language operates. And all of the, in both of these theories, there are assumptions about values and beliefs. G is more explicit about this, but even Swales notes that there are elements of values and beliefs that are conveyed in the way that genres operate, in the way that these groups communicate with one another. And we see this in the Feldman piece, where she notes that, like, for example, in the Star Wars fan community, nostalgia is a key value, right? And that gets expressed in a number of different forms of communication genres within that particular community. So there are some distinctions, right? One of the challenges of G is that the concept of discourse, at least the way that G frames it, is very, very abstract. It is much harder to pin down, where a particular discourse begins and ends. It's almost one of those it when you see it kind of situations. So the boundaries between them are very, very fuzzy. And it's harder to identify, what counts as a discourse in a number of ways. Partly because, the scope of what counts as discourse can vary very widely, right? Your primary discourse might only involve like 3 or 4 people in your home environment, whereas the broader discourse around education includes, millions. So it's much more abstract and fluid than Swales. Swales, right, if there's a critique, it's that he pays significantly less attention to issues of being or factors that make insider status easier for some more than others. So as G points out, language is not neutral, and you don't enter into a new discourse as a blank slate, right? You enter with a primary discourse at the ready, and the degree to which your primary discourse sort of maps onto the secondary discourse that you're trying to master is going to impact the degree to which you are granted membership within that particular discourse. And we see, again, very concrete examples of this going back to last week in the Young essay, where he talks about how an emphasis on a single language standard has a disproportionately negative impact on what G would call sort of speakers of non-dominant discourses, or participants of non-dominant discourses. Regardless of which theory you choose to use for this project, right? Language does not happen in a vacuum. Literacy and insider status of belonging are closely tied together, right? So your performance of your literacy shapes the degree to which you are recognized as being an insider. Literacy is subject to external recognition. So if you're not seen as having it, then you don't have it, right? Like, you can't say, well, I'm literate at X, and then no one recognizes you as being that way. And then finally, how we are seen, right, depends on more than just pure language, right? How we are read by others is shaped by factors beyond our ability to formulate a grammatically correct sentence, right? For G, it's all these other things in combination that are tied to our social context, and for Swales, it really becomes a matter of how our language use fits into the forms and patterns that already exist within a particular kind of community. So as you're thinking about your projects, right, again, there's no right or wrong choice for who you want to use for your theoretical framework, but you do want to think about what specifically you would like to focus your attention on as you are going through the research. And that should hopefully guide some of your thinking about what you want to focus your attention on theoretically in setting up your study and what it's going to attend to. So good luck as you're working on these projects. Take care.